In 1895, Dougald Drummond would take up the mantle of locomotive engineer for the London and South Western Railway. His predecessor had fallen ill and was unable to keep up with his duties. William Adams did leave big shoes to fill. He was responsible for a line of highly successful 440 passenger engines, the also highly successful O2 tanks, the radial tanks, the B4 Dock, and the A12 Jubilees, which I have covered previously. He had made a class of 060s, and he even designed another, which was intended to be built by an outside contractor, but he was unable to see this through, and in 1895 he was forced to retire. At this time, Dougald Drummond stepped in. Drummond, by this time, had a great track record. It seems he had bounced around the UK from the top to bottom, just learning from anyone he could. In 1875, he became locomotive superintendent of the North British Railway, where he built their first C-class, which the later J36s would be updated from. 200 of these were built, and they survived up until 1925. In 1882, he moved from the North British Railway to the Caledonian Railway, and 1 year later he'd start building the 294 class, also known as the Jumbos. 244 Jumbos would be built starting in 1883, but they were good enough that they continued to be built even after he left in 1895. The first of these would be withdrawn after World War II, and only 6 had been withdrawn by the time BR came around. They survived until 1962. So, on the London South Western, they needed a handful of powerful goods engines, and Drummond got to work. 2 years after his arrival, the first of his new goods engines would be delivered from Dubs. 2 months later, the final engine was delivered, totaling 30. To the London South Western, these probably seemed a little bit unusual, but they were fairly standard Drummond designs. Previously, Adams had made the 395 class in 1881, which had fairly large cylinders for the time at 17.5 inches in diameter, but only had a boiler pressure of 140. This resulted in just 15,000 pounds of tractive effort and likely terribly low speeds. 70 of them were built though, so they did fill the need for goods for the most part. The last class of 060 before that consisted of just 8 engines, and they were much smaller and carried the same 140 psi at the time. Drummond's black motors, the 700 class, were much more powerful. They shared many parts, too, with later Drummond classes such as the M7s and C8s. They shared proportions with Drummond's previous 060s as well. He was an early adopter of the 18-inch cylinder, and his C-class and Jumbos both had 5 feet driving wheels. The 700s kept the wheels and went with an even larger 18.5-inch cylinder. The engine alone weighed only a ton more than his previous 060s. However, it did have a higher pressure boiler, and despite the proportions and parts both being proven on other engines, there were teething troubles. They had quirks, but small fixes could be made and they'd settle into their intended purpose very well. November 8th, 1912. Dougald Drummond died while still holding his post as CME of the London and South Western. He'd be succeeded by Robert Urey, an outstanding locomotive designer in his own right. Urey went about making the only major change that would ever happen to the 700s. He gave them superheaters. This meant that a whole rebuild was necessary, to extend the smoke box and frames, as well as raise the boiler and change the shape of the cab to match. Between 1919 and 1929, all of these engines would be given superheaters. In addition to the superheaters, their pistons were made half an inch larger, bringing them up to 19 inches. They ended up renumbered and reclassified, but the nickname Black Motors stuck. They did well with their goods traffic, but the arrival of Urey's S-15 meant that before they were even all superheated, they'd be being moved on to less important work. Then, in the build-up to World War II, Monsell made 20 of his Q-class 060s, which were more powerful than the 700s, but smaller than the S-15s. Now, the war is on, so the 700s were safe. Then again, in 1942, Bullied came out with the best goods engine the Southern Railway had ever seen, the Q1, an 060 substantially stronger than the S-15 and weighing only 8 tons more than the Black Motors. They were strong, fast, and easy to repair. Everything you could ever want from an 060. But somehow, the 700s survived. They all made it through the war and into BR service. The first to go was number 30688, which was destroyed in an accident in 1957. The withdrawals only got serious as standards got pushed into smaller jobs and diesels began to take over. One engine was withdrawn in 1959, one in 1960, 10 in 1961, and the remaining 17 were all withdrawn at once in 1962, meaning the class had a service life of 65 years. However, one was actually steamed by BR in January of 1964, meaning they survived for 67 at least. None of these engines survived into preservation. There wasn't a whole lot of them, and they weren't visibly important to people at the end of their lives. As far as I can tell, there's no new build project. After all, who needs a small, reasonable 060 when you could have another one of those fancy express engines? It really does make sense, despite the way I'm saying it. The humble 060 will never bring as much tourism as a merchant navy or a new-built P2 might. But, on the other end, it'd be a lot cheaper to operate and maintain, for the more dedicated audience to enjoy. Interesting dilemma, but not mine to solve. Thanks for watching, guys, and as usual, if you've got any recommendations for me to cover, please let me know. Like, subscribe, comment, all that engagement farming. I've now done 2 060s in a row, and I'd like to do something different next week. I've got some ideas. I just want to get some variety in there for wheel arrangements. I almost started a script on Peter Drummond's Barneys to follow this one, but it feels like 3 060s in a row would be a bit too much. Thanks for sticking around. I'll be back in a week with another video. Merry Christmas. See y'all in the next one.